Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Wild Like a Flower Gardening. My name is Sarah, and in this video, I'm going to be discussing some basic ecology about our native bees here in North America. I am also going to be covering how we can make our gardens a little more bee-friendly. I'm very thankful that you've been joining me for my pollinator videos. If you wouldn't mind while you're here hitting that like and subscribe button, I would appreciate it so much because it supports me on my journey to share pollinator-related content so we can make our gardens as pollinator-friendly as possible. So let's get started, shall we? I hate this cat toy, oh my gosh. So did you know that there are over 3,500 species of native bees to North America? Now, when you think of bees, do you think of this guy? So this is the European honeybee. This honeybee was brought here to the States specifically for honey production, but has since naturalized itself in our ecosystems, which is why you find them living in the wild. Now, as beloved as the honeybee is, they have found themselves in an awkward situation where they are the spoke species for many native bees here in North America. When people talk about saving the bees, they often are discussing predominantly saving the honeybee. However, we have to target the 3,500 species of native bees just as well because they are struggling too. We are seeing bees disappear on the landscape for a few reasons. They are losing their habitat, and they have been harshly impacted by pesticide use on the agricultural scale. Now, if you love bees, just like me, but you feel like you don't know enough to support them, you are absolutely mistaken. You can love bees and grow an absolutely amazing garden to support their habitat without having to know everything about bees, or even being able to identify them on the landscape. So to kick off our discussion about native bee ecology, we're going to start with their social constructs. So much like humans range from extroverted and introverted, bees kind of do as well. So the first social construct we're going to be talking about is social. Now, a really great example of this would be the honeybee. Social bees have multiple generations of bees living within the same nest. Now, the next construct is communal, where multiple females will raise their young in the same nest with one another. Another social construct, which is much more introverted, is the solitary bee. Solitary bees construct their nests and raise their young all on their own. Lastly, a social construct that I find very interesting is called kleptoparasitic. A bee will lay its egg in the nest of another bee species, so that bee will raise their young for them while they take off to sip pina coladas in your garden. If you're familiar with birds, an example of this is the brown-headed cowbird, which lays its egg in the nest of other songbirds while they take off to party. Now, the bee life cycle is rather simple to understand. Let's start with an adult bee. An adult bee will lay an egg, and that egg develops into a larva. The larva then develops into a pupa, which lastly develops into another adult, which may or may not continue on the life cycle depending on if they are a male or a female. So speaking of eggs, larvae, and pupas, that's got me thinking, where do bees nest? Many of these nesting locations are rather inconspicuous, and us the gardeners may never know that they're there. A very interesting nest location for bees is in the ground. So bees that nest in the ground are going to require patches of bare soil on the landscape or in your garden. So if you're someone who likes to mulch, I would recommend leaving some areas where there is no mulch and there's no plants. So that way these ground nesting bees will be able to create their nests. Another interesting nesting location for bees is burrowing into logs. Now, they may have burrowed into the wood themselves, or they may be using the burrows of, let's say, beetles and other insects that are known to burrow through wood as well. These often look like someone took a little drill and drilled holes into the logs, and it's important that if you're using a firewood pile that you check those logs before you toss them on the fire because they may be home to many different bee species and other insects. Another place I've noticed bees is inside of rock crevices. While I was working at a nature preserve this summer and we were sitting on the patio, a bee worked its way into this little hole in the rocks, which they were sandstone, so the sand wasn't very difficult to manipulate, And I can't tell you if the bee made the hole themselves or if that hole was already there, but it was very interesting to see this tiny little bee go right into this hole. This summer I had a raspberry cutting on my porch, and the old stem from last year that had no new growth was cut. And that stem, a little bee came along and burrowed its way into the stem to use it as a nest. They will also use dried plant stalks from years before that are often already hollow. Something else to consider that's really important for stem nesting bees is that they will spend the winter hibernating in those stems and emerge in the spring. So if you like to cut your plants all the way down to the ground, I recommend only cutting them at about 12 inches above the ground or 12 inches above anywhere that there are signs that a bee has burrowed inside. That will prevent you from tossing them into the landfill with your vegetation cuttings and leaves. Another really important place where bees spend the winter is in the leaf litter. If you're someone who likes to rake up the leaves and ship them off to the landfill, you may be sending many queen bumblebees off to the landfill. Those queens will nestle into the leaf litter and stay there all throughout winter, so it is important to not disturb the leaf litter in fall and to let it remain until the spring. If you must disturb your leaf litter, please designate areas on your property or in your garden where you can leave that leaf litter rather than sending it straight to the landfill. Next, I would like to discuss the food sources for our bees. Many of you may already be familiar with the role pollen plays. Pollen is a sticky substance essential to pollination and the regeneration of plants and food sources for humans. You may have seen many bees, especially honeybees, flying around your garden with little pollen pants on, because as they go from flower to flower, that sticky substance will collect on their legs and they will take it back to their nest to feed their young. Now, adult bees, especially while they're busy foraging, they feed on nectar. And it is important to know that not every flower provides both pollen and nectar. If you're growing for pollinators, you need to make sure that you know what your plants are providing. Are they a pollen source or are they a pollen and nectar source? Because you want to make sure you have both. Bees are working really hard to collect pollen, but they can't collect any nectar for themselves. They're going to be running low on energy. And I don't think any of us like to work really hard while we're hangry, right? So how do bees find the particular plants they're looking for? Well, bees will use a variety of clues to hone in on the species of plants they are most interested in. They will use sense of smell, just like humans do, to pick up on those fragrances that the flowers put off. They will also be searching based on size and shape of the flowers themselves. Now, one of the most important ways that bees find their flower sources that gardeners play a key role in is their UV vision. Much like birds, bees can also see UV, which means that the flowers appear differently to them than they do to humans with our naked eyes. Pictured here is what a flower looks like to us versus under UV light, which is most similar to how the bees will see them. This is important to understand because true native species look a particular way to these bees. And if you are growing cultivars of these true natives or non-native species, the bees may overlook those species and continue on until they find the particular true native they are searching for. This is particularly important to specialist bees. Now, specialist bees are very interesting because they require a particular species of plants. Much like I discussed in my video about moths and butterflies and how they require specific host plants, like let's say they won't lay their eggs on any other species of plant, bees, particularly specialist bees, are out there on the landscape looking for a specific species or a specific family of plants. So if your garden isn't providing some of these plants that the specialist bees rely on, those specialist bees may never come to your garden to begin with. Now I would like to discuss a list of plant species that I've put together to help get you started when planning your garden specifically for our native bees. This list is by no means exhaustive, so you are more than welcome to continue incorporating other native varieties of plants in your garden. But this list I put together to tell you if it offers just pollen or pollen and nectar and how many specialist bees rely on those plants. So to start out with is the Spring Beauty. This is a very early blooming plant variety and it has one specialist bee that relies on it. Spring Beauties provide pollen and start blooming from March all the way through May. Another great spring ephemeral for our native bees is the wild geranium. Wild geranium provides both pollen and nectar and is a key species for one specialist bee. Another great plant species to host in your garden is purple prairie clover. This is a plant species that blooms from May through July and offers both pollen and nectar. Purple prairie clover is also important to 6 specialist bees, so I would highly recommend putting this one in your garden. One of my favorite groups of plants are the milkweeds. You can have common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, you can have world milkweed, the funniest one is hairy balls milkweed, the list can go on. This family of plants is important to many butterfly species, but also provides a fantastic nectar source for native bees. Most milkweeds bloom from June through August, and I have seen some butterfly weeds blooming through September, making them a really great nectar source for migrating butterflies and our native bees preparing for winter. Another fantastic variety that I had a lot of success with growing in my garden is black-eyed Susans. They provide both pollen and nectar, and they bloom from June through September, making them a really great fall variety. Now, black-eyed Susans are very important to specialist bees. Black-eyed Susans have 8 specialist bees that rely on them, making this a fantastic addition to your garden, whether you grow it in a container or you have in-ground growing space for it. Another really fun variety that I had never seen in the wild before I picked it up at the greenhouse in my mom's neighborhood is blue lobelia. My mom saw lots of bumblebees visiting blue lobelia because it provides a really great nectar source along with pollen. Blue lobelia also has a rather long bloom time between July and September. Another fun variety to host in your garden is spotted Joe Pye Weed, which provides both pollen and nectar. This plant blooms from July through September as well. Now, I had a lot of fun this summer growing bee balm, which is a relative of wild bergamot. My bee balm species was grown in a pot and had a lot of success with most of the bumbles in my neighborhood, along with some butterflies. This summer, I plan to be growing some wild bergamot because, like I said before, growing the true natives is much more important than growing the cultivar version. I love my bee balm, but if my target is to grow native wildflowers, I should be using my limited pots for the true native species instead. So wild bergamot is a fantastic source for both pollen and nectar, but is mostly used for its nectar. Wild bergamot blooms from July through September and also has one specialist bee species that relies on it. Now, they also provide a really great nesting location for stem nesting bees, so once they die back, you can cut the flower heads off, making it more readily available for bees who would use it as a nesting location. Field thistle is another great plant to feature in your garden. Now, field thistle can often be confused with the many varieties of non-native thistles that are rather aggressive and can root out native varieties. If you can get your hands on the native field thistle, I would highly recommend it. This is a plant species that will bloom from July through October, making it fantastic for pollinators. Also, it has 3 specialist bee species that relies on it, making it very important to our native bee community. Another one of my favorite plant species to grow is ironweed. Common ironweed blooms from July through September and is a key species for one specialist bee. It is also important to know that common ironweed provides both nectar and pollen, which is a fantastic resource for our late season pollinators. Lastly, one of the plant species that I get most excited for in the late summer is New England asters. Now, I would like to note that New England asters grow kind of big and bushy, so if you plan to feature them in your garden, you're going to want to give them a lot of garden space. Now, New England asters provide both nectar and pollen, which is so important for our bees preparing for winter and a lot of those migrating and overwintering butterfly species. New England asters are also a key species for 11 specialist bees. If that doesn't convince you to grow some of these native varieties, or at least one of them that has a lot of specialist bees that require them, I don't know what will. Because the trend here is that these specialist bees, whether one plant hosts 11 of them or just one, is that you won't see those native varieties of bees in your garden unless you provide those plants for them. I mean, purple prairie clover has 6, black-eyed Susans have 8. It's so important to be growing these flowers in your garden, particularly the true native varieties, to help our native bee populations. I know that many garden mixes of wildflowers will say that they are for pollinators or that they're for butterflies, but those are often misleading. It is so important to check the actual seed lists because you will notice that many of those are non-native seed varieties, or at the very least, they are not actual host plants for bees and butterflies and moths. It can be rather misleading when people talk about pollinator-friendly flowers. Sure, they may provide pollen and nectar, and yes, you don't need to be a purist and grow nothing but true natives in your garden, but please do not be fooled when people say that these plants are pollinator-friendly when all they provide is perhaps a food source, if that. I love zinnias. I fell in love with zinnias this summer, and I will continue to grow them in my garden. They were a hit with various butterflies, and katydids also really like to eat the leaves. However, if I were to be only growing zinnias and other varieties of beautiful flowers that are not native, I am missing all of these native bee species and butterflies that require true native host species in my garden and yours. Lastly, if you've stuck around this long, I want to tell you some of my favorite resources for understanding bee ecology and the plants that they depend on. So I want to start with my free resources that I love so much. As some of you may already know, I'm a resident of Ohio, and Ohio has put together some of these amazing free booklets that you can download as a PDF online, or if you're at one of the parks or Division of Wildlife offices, you can pick up these booklets for free. They have booklets on the native songbirds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, you name it. But some of the most important ones to pollinators, we've got Butterflies and Skippers of Ohio, Moths of Ohio, and the most important to this video are the common bees and wasps of Ohio. Now, in this booklet alone, I have identified bees outside in the wild. I found that I had a 4-toothed mason wasp visiting my garden this summer because I found her in here. She was making a nest out of one of my bamboo stakes that I was using to hold up my lone sunflower on my porch. She ended up capping it with mud, but it was so fun to see her coming and going. You can see her pictured here in the booklet. They have great imaging, and they provide a bit of background information on the species as well, making this a fantastic guide for learning the bees in your area. Now, if you don't live in Ohio, these booklets can apply to some of our neighboring states. If you live out west, I would say that you can look at these if you want to get to know some of the basic ecology about butterflies, moths, bees, you name it, but they may not have all of the species that are in your neighborhood. You may have the western versions of many of these eastern species, but they are amazing nonetheless. Now, another great place to read articles and get information on the ecology behind many of our pollinators and other wildlife is through the Xerces Society. Specifically, I really love the article from Xerces Society on the nesting and overwintering habitat for pollinators. They have a lot of information on the nesting locations of bees and where they overwinter in your gardens, and also how to be gardening more friendly to them. Another really great way to get information on pollinators is by simply following pollinator-related accounts on social media. I follow some on Instagram that have really fantastic photographs of wasps, bees, butterflies, caterpillars, and I have been able to identify some of these species in the wild after seeing them come through on my Instagram feed. I run an Instagram account that is particularly focused on plants, but I will feature butterflies and bees as well. So by simply following them and getting them to come across your feed, you get practice with identifying them just from their photos. If you take a lot of photos while you're outside in your garden, you can post those to iNaturalist, and naturalists and other folks in your community may be able to go on and identify those species for you. Lastly, I want to talk about some of the resources that I did pay for. These are some amazing books, and if you've watched some of my other videos, you already know I am a huge fan of Heather Holm and her books. So the book that I used predominantly to help prepare me to make this video for you guys is her book on bees. Now, her books are amazing. The photographs and the attention to detail that Heather puts into these answers almost every question you could possibly think about relating to our pollinators. I'll give you just a quick snippet of what it looks like inside. Amazing photographs. Just absolutely amazing. She gives detailed information on the species and the family and the basic ecology. She also has plant guides in here to help you prepare your gardens with plant profiles that give you all sorts of information on that plant so you, the gardener, can determine if it's possible for you to grow that in your garden. Information on sun, shade, if it likes it wet or if it likes it dry. That way you can be most prepared to grow them in your garden. I highly recommend this book if you're getting serious about growing for native bees in your garden or creating bee habitat on a larger scale. My first book that I got from Heather, which really geeked me out, is her Pollinators of Native Plants. Now, this is an amazing book that covers not just bees, but butterflies, moths, and lots of other insect species that use various native plants in our gardens. Again, she's got really fantastic plant profiles with really amazing images of the insects that can be found on them. And this book goes into plants that are more prairie, plants that like wetland, plants that like woodland, which would be more shady. So you, the gardener, can really go through this and decide what plants would fit your garden the best and get an idea of who you might start to see if you do feature those plants in your garden. So Heather, if you find my videos, I am a huge fan. I am also incredibly impressed with the photographs. If you could let us know how you get these bees and other pollinators to hold still long enough to take these amazingly detailed photographs, please let us know. Most of my photos of bees, they're buzzing by and it's kind of blurry. I can only get lucky once in a blue moon if I don't spook them off of the flowers while they're feeding. So I am just constantly impressed whenever I flip through these books. Now, I know this has a focus on bees, but I also want to mention if you have an interest in other pollinators such as wasps. Not all wasps are out to get you, all right? I know there's yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets, and everyone gets really scared when they see a wasp because they think they're going to come and they're going to sting you. And yes, being stung by wasps sucks. It absolutely sucks. But not every species of wasps are aggressive or have the intention to sting you. And Heather has a book coming out specifically on native wasps. Promise it's not the book, I know, sad, but right now, it's up for pre-order, which I pre-ordered it, and by the time you watch this video, it may be ready to be shipped as soon as you order. I'm not sure. So if you are interested in wasps, I highly recommend checking out her new book because I have a feeling it's going to be fantastic. Again, I would really like to thank you for joining me on my journey to provide you with pollinator-related resources. And while you're here, Sprout says you should really hit that like and subscribe button so you can join us next time. So thank you and happy gardening.